This is The Reason interview with Nick Gillespie. My guest today is David Lowery, the legendary frontman of the bands Camper Van Beethoven and Cracker, digital copyright crusader, PhD, and longtime Reason reader. We dive deep into his sprawling, deeply personal new record, Fathers, Sons, and Brothers. And we also talk about how the music industry broke and maybe, just maybe, how to fix it. He sued Spotify and other streaming services in the past, teaches business at the University of Georgia, and he's dropped what might be the best one-liner about selling out since The Who back in their 60s heyday. If you care about music, creative freedom, and getting paid for your work, this one is for you. Here is the Reason interview with David Lowery. David Lowery, it is a pleasure to be talking to you. Thanks for talking to Reason.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And you have told me in a different conversation when you were a wee student at UC Santa Cruz, you had a roommate or a dorm mate who was a Reason reader. Can you remind me about that?
Yeah. Well, there was a couple, but the kind of connections to that. But yeah, I had he wasn't really a roommate, but he lived in the same building, was a guy that we just called Scott the Anarchist. And that was sort of where my introduction to the magazine came from. And then I later, when I was in college, I worked at a farm, which is detailed on this solo album. And the owner was just a full-blown anarcho-capitalist, I would say. Yeah. And
so did that mean you had to pay to leave the job every day or something like that? Or, I mean, that could be a brutal regime.
Right. Yeah. That's my description of him. We got along actually pretty well. And but considering Santa Cruz was so like lefty, I sort of found like the two, my calculation is that I probably found the two sort of libertarian anarchists in the whole county, right? And they sort of were influential to me in a lot of ways, so. Well,
it's always good to, when you're in any kind of monoculture, right, to hang out with the people who are kind of not quite fitting in. So.
Absolutely.
So, well, let's talk about the. We're going to talk about your experiences with Camper Van Beethoven and Cracker and the music industry more broadly, especially issues about IP as music shifted from kind of record stores and analog needles dragging through vinyl to streaming. All kinds of the interesting IP battles and the way that record labels went from being villainous for one reason and then for other reasons. We'll talk about that in a bit. But first, I want to talk about the new record, Fathers, Sons, and Brothers, which is a musical memoir, a musical autobiography that you've released on vinyl as well as online. And you're writing a Substack where you kind of explain the background of each song. Can you explain why, what you're trying to do with Fathers, Sons, and Brothers and why now?
Right. So I started this shortly before COVID, and it was mostly, I sort of felt like there were some people in my life that sort of, kind of deserved their own song or a little explanation or something like that. And then, so that's sort of a memoir-ish type thing. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I'd had several people sort of urging me that sort of now's the time in your life when you do the sort of autobiography. But there's definitely a formula to doing these sort of rock autobiographies, and I didn't have a lot of the elements there in my opinion. Like I didn't struggle. I didn't like the first album Camper Van Beethoven puts out gets played on the BBC. So there's a lot of the sort of the tension that isn't there. Right. So instead,
there's no airplane crash that wipes out half the band or anything. Yeah.
That's right. I didn't have the parents, that shipped me off to some sort of, indoctrination camp because I became a punk rocker or something like that. You know what I mean? Like none of those things happened to me. Everybody was supportive. I got lucky all the time. Yeah. So the shape of the written autobiography was sort of, to me, wasn't there. So I thought, well, And, and then also too, you write all the time. That's a very different skill than writing music. I only have to worry about 5 minutes, Yeah. And so I just felt like this was going to be a whole new skill I was going to have to learn to write an autobiography. And so I thought, well, why don't I just do it I'm already doing sort of checking some boxes, writing about some people that I need to write about. Why don't I just do it I'll just start recording CDs, essentially, and I'll be done when I'm done, I'll start recording these songs. So that's how it started. And then the other element of it, though, was interesting to me because for me, it's easier for me to write music than it is to write lyrics. I know it may not sound like that, but it's hard to find things to sing about. I keep a little notepad file in my phone where I write down titles or an idea or something just because I need those. And this was easy because I'd be like, okay, I talk about my sister now. I want to talk about my grandfather on my mom's side, when I talk about this. So it was sort of a good plot device, something like that for me to do this. And then it matched the COVID sort of shutdown where everything sort of in the music business went away. About a year into this, we had the COVID shutdown, and then it's like, okay, well, this is really personal. It's just me sitting with my little tiny digital 8-track recorder. It matched the COVID time. I'm sitting here with my laptop by myself or my little digital recorder by myself, and I'm emailing files off to friends. So a methodology grew out of it as well.
Part of what's striking, and I think the first song on the album, or whatever we're going to call it. I mean, can we call it an album still?
Yeah, it's an album. Yeah, it's just three 2 discs, 3 vinyl.
Yeah. No filler, right? And no filler.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
But I mean, the opening song has, it reminds, or it recollects your first memory, or something close to it.
Right.
But you write, I mean, you're in Georgia now, you spend time in Virginia, but fundamentally, you're the musical space that you seem to occupy generally, but especially on this record, to me anyway, is California. And
that's right.
Can you talk a little bit about, California, like you mentioned in a song, a super bloom of a certain kind of flower weed in the Coachella Valley. Talk a bit about that. And what does California mean? Because California in rock music, California is the backdrop for a lot of stuff. Like, it seems like things very quickly left Philadelphia and New York, and being up on the rooftop in New York or being real hot in the city or something like that, to this California, which can mean a lot of different things. But what does California mean to you? And what does that super bloom represent to you?
Yeah. So the super bloom was doing 2 things. So the super bloom is the late winter, early spring burst of wildflowers that you will get in the desert if the conditions are right. Not every year, sometimes skips 10 years or whatever like that. And, it's this explosion of life, right? And so in one way, I'm talking about sort of the explosion of life in that it's my age. I'm like 14 years old, boys are growing, you're turning into sort of getting elements of being an adult, and stuff like that. But it was also California at that time, which had gone through kind of a super bloom where everybody that was around me, where we lived in California. My father was in the Air Force. He got stationed in California. Was in the Coachella, was in an area called the Inland Empire, which is right next to a separate area called the Coachella Valley. Right. And it was had exploded with people, mostly immigrants from other parts of the United States, specifically a lot of people from the South and from Texas and Oklahoma and places like that. And you just kind of had this wild blossoming of sort of not just life, but sort of the economy and culture and things like that. Most people tend to focus on San Francisco and Hollywood at that time, or coastal LA, but the same thing happened inland in the deserts. my grandparents came out there and cousins came out there basically to work in the agricultural industry and stuff like that, and then sort of shifted to servicing like the rich people and the golf courses and the Hollywood celebrities in Palm Springs and stuff like that. It was just this really fascinating time, a good time to be alive in California, and I have a more positive spin on it than, like, say, Joan Didion's, like,
the dreamers of the dream, and all of that. It's like,
I have a more positive take on it than she does.
Talk about that, because that's, the Grapes of Wrath, of course, ends with the Okies leaving the Dust Bowl, and then you kind of skip ahead, and you get to Joan Didion, or before her James Cain, and Hard Boiled, that or Nathaniel West, that California, particularly Southern California, is kind of the asshole of the country, and all of the bad people get shaken down into there, and it's a hard, grubby déclassé life of endless yearning and dissatisfaction. You have a different view of that.
Well, yeah, my family came out of such poverty in Arkansas and personal tragedy as well too, which I go into the record. That, I mean, it was my grandfather didn't read or write. He signed his name with an X. He basically took care. He was like horses, farming, agriculture. Figured out how to service people's pools with a little side business for him.
Swimming pools, cement ponds, right?
The cement ponds, yeah. And for them, this was a wonderful life. They made decent money. They bought a house again. Eventually their children and the grandchildren heard about the wonderful life in California, and they all followed them out there. You know what I mean? And at first they really were literally in the fields picking fruit, picking dates. Was a big thing to do. Was difficult, dangerous work. And then, eventually nobody ever got rich, although my uncle was the marshal of Riverside County at one point. But,
and you had a couple of cousins who got
who were on the other side of the law.
That's right. So it shaped. Well,
did a rock.
The album though is not. It is not some kind of like super feel good album. There's a lot of darkness and tragedy, but also hope in it. And it reminded me a lot of another, I guess, California transplant who didn't end up as well, Graham Parsons, but like there's a touch in this album of what he used to call cosmic American music, which is very rooted in kind of Americana tradition, particularly blues and R&B and country. And what used to be called hillbilly music, and it's both uplifting and sad at the same time. Does that resonate with you? That kind of it seems to me there's a whole vein. Brian Wilson died recently, and like the Beach Boys, on the one hand, they're the happiest band on earth, and they're upbeat, and they all look good, and they have white teeth and blue eyes and blonde hair, and yet there's something unbelievably sad and depressing about their music. I find the Byrds are like this too, and I don't think this album is not depressing, but it has that mix of it's upbeat, it's yearning, it's positive, but it's also deeply kind of riven with sadness and tragedy.
Yeah, so the song that probably does that the most is Piney Woods, which discusses this area of Arkansas, Louisiana, and East Texas. And I have a song that's just kind of a study of the area. But specifically, if you listen to the melody of that song, it is the most sort of almost totally major key, almost straight up melody. But it's a very positive melody, but the subject matter of it it got better and better the more I just dealt with the details of the song, which is the murder suicide of my dad's brother. And that was the contrast that really made that song work. And it is like, it's very much, it's almost so folky. It harkens back more to the Celtic roots of the American forms, right? It's almost there. It's so folky, right? And that's like part of it. There's also the fact that like, so a lot of my perspective is an inland California perspective, which is much more, you could Bakersfield, obviously, but is much more infused with kind of the Southern and the country rock music, whereas the Beach Boys have less of that, in what they do. Right. So that's some of it as well.
Who do you count as your, as your musical icons that, because, it was also interesting listening to this record, Neil Young during COVID, who, Canadian by birth, Californian by choice, I suppose. He released a bunch of performances as well as songs during COVID that also, were somehow set in a psychic California. And that, that can be both upbeat and downbeat at the same time. But who, and I was thinking you're like occupying the Riverside County kind of, or, the Inland Empire version of Neil Young's Northern California. And who are your musical like heroes that you, that guide you?
Well, I think I'm probably pretty influenced, honestly, by sort of the classic rock artists and stuff like that. But if you want to talk sort of specifically about this sort of little niche that I've moved into, I would say it's the biggest influence probably was Kaleidoscope.
Oh yeah,
with the American, with David Lindley,
and they have the one song of theirs I know well, I believe, is the Sky Children.
Is that the I don't know if I know that. There's two kaleidoscopes. There's a British kaleidoscope and there's a Southern California kaleidoscope.
Oh, okay. So this may be the other one, but talk about Southern California Kaleidoscope.
So California Kaleidoscope, they were also from the Inland Empire. It was David Lindley, who's a fiddler, guitarist, and played with everybody from like Jackson Browne, did television themes, all kinds of stuff, right? But this was his 60s psychedelic folk band. They all played different instruments. They all played fiddle at some point on the record. And I remember I started Camper Van Beethoven and I gave a tape to Ray Farrell from SST and he goes, "Oh, so you guys loved Kaleidoscope growing up?" And I was like, "Who?" They're from your neighborhood.
Yeah.
How do you not know them? Right. So in a way, that's the big Camper Van Beethoven influence. And then from there, I suppose, like I had to retroactively discover stuff. Like I had to discover like Bruce Springsteen in the mid 2000s, things like that would happen to me just because I was like, I don't know. I just had some impression of what he was about and it was like wrong. And, so in a way there's some of, Bruce Springsteen's Ghost of Tom Joad in this album. Right. In fact, to the point where I accidentally took a chord progression, but that's all right. Chord progressions aren't copyrightable. But
give it time.
Give it time, yeah. So it's kind of all over the place, but I do will point for this record. I point at those two. Yeah, literally Kaleidoscope and like I know Bruce Springsteen is sort of playing characters, and then sort of telling their story. Yeah. So in this, I'm not playing a character, right? But just sort of his randomness, where he'll talk about like really specific things, like a woman's shoe and the size of the shoe, as he fits her for a shoe. Like really in small details that makes the song come to life and stuff. that. So I got to say there's some of that in there as well too. I could go on and on listing off people.
Let's talk about Camper Van Beethoven, because they were a band. I wrote for the American version of Smash Hits, which was, if you ever wanted to confess to a murder, that was the magazine to do it in, because nobody read it. I remember coming across Our Beloved Revolutionary Sweetheart. And I reviewed it. I gave it a thumbs up, or we might have used like 2 fingers up or 3 fingers up because we were cheeky and different. But Camper Van Beethoven was kind of one of the archetypal indie rock bands of the 80s when that mattered. And there's an irony that is infused in that music that is, I don't know how to describe it. Can you talk about where that came from? And one of the songs in one of the songs on Fathers, Sons, and Brothers, you reference "Take the Skinheads Bowling," which became this mass hit, and that was like life-changing for you, because that made the band popular in a way that meant you were going forward in the music industry. But can you talk about where did the ironic sensibility of Camper Van Beethoven come from? And then how did Take the Skinheads Bowling being popular change the direction of your life?
Camper Van Beethoven was a reaction to sort of the seriousness of sort of hardcore punk rock, which hadn't started that way, by the way.
Right.
Kind of hardcore West Coast punk rock, and then sort of the post-punk British stuff. Everything was heavy seriousness. And, there's a little bit of the punk rock spirit that always forces you to rebel about whatever the status quo is. And in our case, our status quo had become sort of the punk rock and the post-punk rock sort of scene that we all grew up in, right? And I remember like our demo tape at some point got reviewed by the punk fanzine Maximum Rock and Roll.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Where they just sort of said, hey, these guys don't sound punk, but they're absolutely the spirit of punk, right?
Yeah.
In a way. So that encouraged us, right?
Yeah.
And it was kind of us being sort of ironic or tongue-in-cheek while still trying to be serious. Maybe the way that a Kurt Vonnegut writes, there's some sort of humor or non-seriousness in his serious writing.
Yeah.
It's also a very postmodern sort of thing.
Right.
Sort of second order, there's sort of second order meaning in the songs and stuff like that. That we're just like, we really don't want to play lacrosse in the song Club Med Sucks. This is kind of tongue in cheek is what we're saying. Yeah. So that just worked for us immediately. And we felt like, well, we could be a serious band because, look, the Beatles did that sometimes, the Kinks did that a lot, and so it just didn't frighten us away. And so we just,
why do you think punk got so serious? Because when it started, and it's useless to get into like strict definitions of punk, et cetera, but it was, it started as a burst of energy and a reaction to, kind of prog rock or over serious mega productions done by hippies, let's say. Then, and it was fun and exciting, and it was short, and then it itself became really serious, especially kind of the Southern California punk scene seemed to, Ronnie Reagan and everything was serious and political. Why did that happen?
I'm not really sure, but I mean, there is a tendency when you belong to a group to want to dress the same or with a similar sensibility, and that gets more and more refined. There's a Substack and a long-running sort of blog called Punk Turns 30, which I think now it's probably Punk Turns 45. I believe it's Teresa Kariakis and Pleasant Gaiman, who still run that blog. And they have a lot of photos. Teresa was a photographer, and she's photo documents it. And there's a point where like the 78, the way people looked in 78 in the LA punk rock scene and what they were wearing, just, it's really a wide platter of styles, and it kind of narrows down over the next few years. I assume something like that also happens with music. And it's sort of the building of a community out of something anarchic causes that.
Yeah.
And that's what Camper is reacting to, is like, okay, we're going to do that. Let's wear the hippie clothes. I'm going to wear a poncho.
Yeah.
Like no punk rocker would wear a poncho, so that's us trying to take it apart again.
So take the Skinheads Bowling. Talk a little bit about how you came to write that song, and then how it was successful.
Yeah, so it's kind of the same. It's part of that impulse, right? It's like, okay, so that's when a lot of us, say 83 or something like that, are noticing that, some part of punk rock has become very dogmatic, and you've kind of got the skinheads and they've got their look. Not all of them were, there's this kind of a moral panic about Nazi skinheads. I never saw any. But there's sort of, they were sort of seen as a bad part of the movement. And so this is us kind of just mocking them at first in a song that doesn't, just a single line that doesn't really mean anything. And then just because it didn't mean anything, it became a little project of mine to take this song idea that we had kind of come up with and just make it so that it didn't make any sense and didn't say anything and didn't mean anything in reaction to everything that came before us. So I'm like really carefully with each line, like going, okay, I'm going to say something now and it seems like I'm going somewhere. Now I'm going to say something else and it doesn't lead you anywhere. And it was just completely like an absurd sort of impulse or something like that. But that song being so much that way and being so different, and also just having a catchy hook on the chorus, it when we mailed it out, and this is us really mailing it out to like BBC DJs, that's addresses and the names of the DJs, we mailed this thing out. I think it just kind of stood out to people. They looked at it, take this Bowling, they saw that title on the record. They're like, well, what is this? And they put it on the turntable and like, oh, this is catchy. We can play this, right?
Yeah.
But there's nothing else on that record that is as catchy and also as sort of a fun chorus to sing. And so my take on all of this is the fact that went on the record, and it's kind of buried on the record. It's like track 7 or something like that. The fact that song took off really kind of changed our trajectory, right? I could have easily seen us, we were very hyperactive, very creative group of people, not always on the same page together and stuff like that. But the fact that we kind of had this single and we had to go around and play that song as well as our other songs, focused our mind. And I think in a lot of ways, without that song, we wouldn't have gone on to we might have made a couple of records and then just wandered off and done other things. That song really made it so I was on a me at least. Yeah. I was at least on a professional sort of musician songwriter path. Without on the first record, I think it's like my life is different. And that's kind of what I talk about in that song, right?
Yeah. And well, so you were saying earlier that you don't have the ingredients of the classic kind of behind the music documentary biography, but on Fathers, Sons and Brothers, you do have a song about the end of Camper Van Beethoven, which takes place
we hate
on
you.
ferries, and going to Sweden and whatnot. So there's a little bit of that. But what was it like to be an indie darling in the 80s, though, as that concept was, like when you go back and you look to the 60s, it wasn't, nobody wanted to be a boutique indie artist in the 60s. They wanted to be on the top of the pops, at the top of the, the top 40 or whatever. And even through the 70s, when you think of somebody like Bruce Springsteen, he doesn't matter if he's not on CBS Records, right, or something. He matters less. In the 80s, and with the rise of what was called college rock, and we'll get to the high point of alt music in a bit, but being an indie artist where you could be quirky and inventive and offbeat and get compensated for it. That seemed like you were living the life, right? I mean, or what did it feel like to be like that? And what kind of pressures go into maintaining that as opposed to kind of doing the same thing over and over again?
Yeah. So you actually hit on something, that there is an economic component to this 80s indie rock, 90s indie rock thing. I mean, the reason the folks in the 60s and 70s, there was sort of, you may have been underground, but you were trying to rise to the top of the charts, was because that was where the money was, and you need money to keep the whole thing going. I mean, even if you're driven by an intense artistic vision, you do need that. And in the 80s, the independent music systems kind of blossomed and came of age. And it was indie music was called indie music at first because of how you organized your band business. You went through independent distributors, your records were sold at independent record stores, and you were probably only on college radio or non-commercial radio, right? Like suddenly you could make a decent living, maybe not like you weren't rich, but you could be middle-class artists off of this system. And we were, right? We bought a car, I didn't buy a house. It was Santa Cruz, California, but, but that was one element of it. But it also began to have a lot of rules that went along with it. I didn't feel like it had those rules at first, but eventually sort of rules developed. And I remember there was a backlash to the fact that, Camper Van Beethoven covered Status Quo's Pictures of Matchstick Men and kind of had a hit with it. Like a lot of people and a lot of critics grumbled at us on that album because hey, you're doing a cover song that's not even your own song,
right?
And so there were odd pressures like that. I remember a couple years later, Cracker's first album, somebody came to us, an ad agency came to us, and they wanted our song for a beer commercial. It was Coors, actually, I think, and which at that time, seemed to be like a real no-no. And we were like, it was so much money. We're like, we'll take it. Take it, right? But there were literally like op-eds in the music trades about whether we should have taken that commercial, right?
And both because it was a commercial to begin with, and then because it was Coors, which was associated with Coors went from being cool when Paul Newman drank it in the 60s and 70s before it was available nationally, to being a dangerously right-wing beer because the Coors family somehow were funding the Contras against the Sandinistas or something.
Well, it was something like that. And so, we kind of stepped in it, but we're like, it was so much money. We were like, you get record advances, but you have to spend the record advances on the record. And sometimes you have to use some of that money for the touring too. You might get additional advances for touring, but,
so what did the pressures of being an indie artist, I mean, it's not that you're totally free of pressures. It's just, it's a different set of
It was a different set of pressures and stuff like that. And then I think it also, then the music sort of became stylized, where at first what was indie was all over the map, because it literally was. It was just describing a separate economic system for distributing and selling records. That was based on the punk rock methods, right? It was just that it wasn't punk rock anymore.
So it's and that's much more do it yourself, and kind of like you record the records, you produce the records, or, go to the record pressing plant, get it out, and then literally are mailing it out to smaller record stores and things like that.
Or using an independent distributor to do that. So we used Rough Trade, which was a vertical with stores, distributor, and a label as well too. And then sort of eventually we sort of had a deal with them exclusively for a while.
Right. And then did Camper Van Beethoven sign with Virgin?
We signed with Virgin, which at first was the largest independent in the world.
Right.
Has an interesting history. Richard Branson was like an interesting charismatic figure in the music business before he was known for his other ventures and stuff like that.
Right. And the guy who became a major record label owner by doing Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells, right?
Yeah,
so
the soundtrack to The Exorcist and selling it out of the trunk of his car.
Yeah.
So us signing with him, even though he was basically considered part of the major label world when we signed, was to us like, well, here's the bridge. This guy is the bridge between these worlds. And literally, I talk about it in one song on Father, Sons, and Brothers. I remember at some point trying to give a theory of our album, our upcoming album, The Camper Van Beethoven, Our Beloved Revolutionary Sweetheart, to one of the executives there, who was the president at the time, Jeff Eroff, who immediately is just like, kind of didn't have time for me, but didn't want to be mean, but it was just like, look, don't worry about it. Just write songs. You'll write a hit by accident. Right. That's the old school music business, right? The throw 10 records against the wall, see what sticks. Just give us a bunch of songs. Don't stop writing, don't stop recording. Just give us a bunch of songs. We'll worry about everything else. Right. Yeah. That was a great time to go into transition into the major labels, because there was still that, sort of approach to creativity. Not everybody, but there were still a lot of people like that in the business, right? Yeah.
And then as Camper Van Beethoven ends at the end of the 80s and you transition to Cracker, can we talk a bit about, by that point, alt music or alternative music, because it's became to the fore, and it seemed as if not just in the music industry but more broadly that things like rock music were fading in their cultural hold, and stuff was opening up, and the labels, this happened to the movie studios certainly at the end of the 60s, and and it continues to happen with publishing houses, et cetera, where they realize they no longer understand their business, or they don't understand their audiences, and they start to either get rigid and say, no, we're not doing anything different, or they go all in on trying out all different types of things. But it seemed like when you look at the early 90s music scene, so much is going on, and you came into it with Cracker in a really good position, right? Because you kind of got to punch your own ticket economically within the mainstream, which was desperately trying to appeal to something known as like an alternative nation. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like?
Yeah. So Camper Van Beethoven had gotten onto MTV in regular rotation, not just in the special shows, although the specialty shows were hugely important. 120 minutes was landmark, that introduced sort of the underground to middle America, but we were on, like, not really heavily, but we were in regular rotation on MTV. There were also about 30 commercial stations, maybe 50 around the country, that were playing modern rock. I don't even know if they were called alternative rock yet, but they were commercial radio stations, right? And so we were one of their bands, right? And when Camper Van Beethoven breaks up, and then I create this band Cracker with my friends, we put out a record. We sort of get the seat that Camper Van Beethoven's been holding, in a way, even though we're different. We do kind of, and what has happened, though, is that those 30 to 50 stations with Camper Van Beethoven have now expanded to this panel of like 200 or 300 stations, because rock radio, AOR rock radio, dying, and they're looking for something else. There's also probably the deregulation of the radio business, where you suddenly had chains of radio stations in Camper's days, but you start to have them in Cracker's days. We were just sort of like these big tectonic plates were moving. And we were just kind of, part of it was, we made good songs, we made good records, but you can make, plenty of people make good songs and good records and stuff like that, get popular. We were kind of in the right place at the right time. We were in this modern radio format. We were a core band, and it explodes nationally. And then, like, that's really when we're, in the pop star part of the music business, and, although we were alternative rock stars. So.
So, but then the center can't hold, right? Because the early 90s, I mean, it's fascinating looking back on it. And, it was kind of evident, but you have bands like you have, Nirvana and the kind of, grunge sound coming up big. You have, Guns N' Roses, which is obviously about to destroy itself, but like there had been a kind of resurrection of straight on American rock and roll or whatever they were claiming to do. And then you had all this other stuff, in terms of like rap and hip hop really coming into its own. What, how did you navigate that kind of musically? Or do you, I mean, when you're playing in something like that, do you become more experimental or do you become more focused on what you are doing alone?
Well, there's always the impulse to make sure, coming from management, from labels, and just you as an artist, you're like, I got to be aware of what other people are doing, what the audience wants and stuff like that to a certain extent, while not pandering to it.
Right.
And that's always a tricky line to walk. So you hear on Cracker's 1996, The Golden Age, in a way, that's sort of the most alternative rock album that we make, right? But it's almost like a year or two behind by the time it comes out, it's almost a year or two behind what alternative rock had become. Alternative rock had become much harder. It was leaning towards metal. It was leaning towards metal rap and stuff. So the first two Cracker records are very Americana roots oriented, but they had songs that fit on alternative rock radio. Golden Age tries to lean into the alternative rock stuff a little bit, but we do clever things. Like we hire Beck's dad, David Campbell, is an amazing string arranger, to arrange a lot of this stuff. So it's cool and weird and angular strings on it and all kinds of stuff, right? But by the time we get to the fourth album, The Gentleman's Blues, we're like, okay, alternative rock radio is going off someplace else. That's not the style of music we write. It's not our strengths. Yeah. And we go just completely make essentially roots rock record. Yeah. Country, blues, straight ahead rock.
Yeah. Kind of coming into its own as well, or finding an audience.
Yes. It's becoming jam bands or sort of reinvigorating that space or something like that. So in one ways, yes, we did follow the trends a little bit. I mean, because we're like, hey man, we're good musicians, we're good writers, we can write anything, right? We're not selling our soul by doing this, but we are following the trends a little bit. But it's really only for kind of one record. And and then we're like, okay, that didn't work. We'll just do what we do, right?
Did you have a conversation? Because these are kind of conversations that seem to have died, and I think that's generally a good thing. The idea that like, well, if if you're an artist and you sell out, I mean, and obviously the Who obviously have an album called The Who Sell Out from the '60s, so there's this is an old kind of and I guess the Byrds, So You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star, talking about like selling out to the company or whatever. And we can go on and on, but in the late 80s and certainly in the 90s, that seemed to be front of mind for many people. Like, the main thing is, man, don't sell out. And, did you guys worry about that you might be selling out, or were you kind of like, what the fuck does that even mean?
Yeah, we always, with Cracker especially, there's a little bit of just sort of like, we're just going to be iconoclast. If selling out is uncool, we're going to do it, or we're going to claim to do it whether we are or not. You know what I mean? Because kind of trolling people in a way. We didn't have that word then, but there was a little bit of that in our persona. But I mean, it even says in Get Off This, the second albums, see, I can't remember lyrics unless I sing them, but we talk about, is it true that you have sold your soul? I don't know, man. Lend me a quarter. I'll call my accountant. Right. Yeah. Right. I don't know if anybody can even tell what we're saying in that song. Yeah. But we're playing with that. We're reacting against that. Yeah. Plus a lot of the bands that were underground at one point and sort of deemed being sort of the coolest of the cool, like, the Soundgardens and Nirvana and Pearl Jam. We're selling tens of millions of records.
That's right.
So by that point, we're like, I don't know what selling out means.
Right.
So
yeah.
It's exactly what you're saying. And that's kind of what kills it. By 94, you're like, I don't know what selling out means,
Right.
So,
I mean, and it definitely being true to your school, if you're not selling any records, like that might mean that you're just not making good music, which is not necessarily true, but.
Right. Not necessarily true. You might be ahead of the curve.
Yeah. Or I mean, you can be Alex Chilton, but nobody wants to be Alex Chilton when he's 40 or 45 years old.
That's
right?
That's exactly right.
And he fucked up his second bite at the apple, I guess. What was going on, to talk about trolling? What went into the making of Tusk? Your cover of the, of what is one of the most controversial and kind of bizarre Fleetwood Mac records.
Yeah. So Camper Van Beethoven covers the album Tusk, and it was partly because we had decided to get back together, but we thought it would actually be just kind of funny if we didn't really tell anybody. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why. This is just the high concepts that like amuse us. So we're like, we released this thing called Camper Van Beethoven is Dead, Long Live Camper Van Beethoven, basically telling people that we got back together in the song title, but nobody getting it. And it was an album there were some outtakes, there were some leftovers from the early career that we put on this album, but a lot of stuff was new that we created, and we released a fake out, Oddities album as our first record back together. So even though there's clues all the way through it, including a thing in Morse code, which explains what we're doing on the record, nobody got it. So they were like, okay, that was fun. That kind of worked. And we sold, there's a bunch of camper oddities that were never released, right? So we're like, okay, that's fun. So what should we do? Oh, I know what we should do. We should release a cover of an entire album. I don't know who came up with this idea. It might have been Jonathan, or I don't know who it was, but somebody came up with it. Said we should release an entire album, cover of an entire album, and say that we recorded it back in the 80s and we discovered the tapes, right? So what would that album be? And of course, everybody goes Tusk, because we were obsessed with the album Tusk by Fleetwood Mac, and so in some ways, what we're doing with that album is we're also trying to rehabilitate that album, because even though it's spotty, there's some bad stuff on it that just really doesn't quite work on that Fleetwood Mac album. There's a lot of great stuff on that album, and it's just really an unusual work of art by Tusk.
And they owned the industry at that point. They could do whatever they wanted, and it's on some level it is a monument to self-indulgence, and on another level,
which is
it's kind of
rock.
But why not take that? Why not do whatever the fuck you want when you have, when you're coasting off of rumors, right?
Right. So what we did was we re-recorded that album, but had this fake press release that was like, we recorded it in 1986 in California, staying at a friend's parents' cabin. We got snowed in, so we just decided to cover Tusk on a 4-track. So we tried to record it on a 4-track. We were recording on professional equipment. We tried to keep it to 4 tracks. We couldn't. The law of tracks just comes in, filling them all up. But we did use a drum machine from that year to sort of give it the feel of that year. Yeah. And so we released this fake thing from this thing that wasn't really from our catalog, and put this album out, and it got everybody talking about that album. And we did it in like 3 days, like we said we would do, and got everybody talking about that album, which was kind of the point of that album, was that it we thought this was a great record and it sort of deserved its due. So here's another look at that record. Maybe people will come to love the Tusk album, which I think we were part of rehabilitating that album in the eyes of a lot of people.
Let's jump ahead to some of your criticisms and actual legal actions against streaming services and whatnot, because you, and at various points, I mean, everybody in the bands that you've been associated with are like incredibly tech savvy. People have worked at places like Pandora and are computer programmers. Your music is heavily, heavily indebted to technology and like a knowledge of and love of kind of forward avant technology. You've been critical, particularly about 10 or 15 years ago or so. You were very critical of the way that streaming services did not compensate content creators. And you pointed out in several interviews, I think it was that for a million streams or plus of Low, one of Cracker's best known songs, which name checks, and I'm saying this for people who haven't heard it, please listen to it, but it talks about a junkie cosmonaut at one line. That is one of the great rock lyrics that has just stuck in my head forever. I'll probably say it on my deathbed, but for, a million streams of that on Pandora, you would get paid as the writer and as, and as a performer on it, something like $17.
So I think in that article, I detailed that it's actually about more like $140 that goes towards the label, the publisher, the performers, and the songwriter. But my actual share of that as being a band member on a label was $17. And I do, I'm the major writer on that. I have the most writing on it. I do explain that, but that is specifically with Pandora, which is at that time was non-interactive streaming, so the royalties were very, very low on that.
Right.
They're a bit higher when you get to interactive streaming, but so this is one of the reasons why it's great to talk about this on this podcast. Is a lot of people don't realize this, but at least the songwriting part of the music business is highly regulated. There are, like, for instance, in the digital realm, songwriters don't really set the price for their songs, nor do they negotiate with anybody. There are these compulsory licenses. And the formula for paying those artists is set by an administrative law board in the Library of Congress called the Copyright Royalty Board. And what happened was always good intentions, in the 90s, the federal government saw the digital age coming along. And they're like, well, what should we do about music and copyright, with these new digital services that are coming? We'll make some compulsory licenses. Now, there's different ones depending on how it's being used and stuff like that. So I don't want to go into the detail on that. But effectively, those rates and the formulas for determining the rates to songwriters eliminated any sort of market for songs in the digital realm, and also set the rates too low. And I think
when you say they set the rates too low, what do you mean by that?
Well, they created a formula that, so they set the rates too low. Well, I'll just say this. Like if I write a song 100% and I own all of the publishing on it, I don't sell any of it off to anybody or something like that. On a streaming service, on the best paying streaming services, I might get a little under a 1/10 of a penny for each stream. So take a 5-minute song and you say, well, how long does this have to play for, say, me to make $1 or me to make $12 if, you make $12 an hour or stuff like that. You end up with these enormously large, like somebody's paying maybe, $5 for 3 weeks solid of music or something like that. Maybe this was 3 months, or I can't remember what it was. That doesn't, there's no free market. So it is really hard to say what the value is. So I guess that's a subjective opinion, but doesn't seem right. And when
the rates are certainly lower than they were for radio play.
Yes, but
right.
there's
that's also complicated. Yeah,
that's complicated in the sense that each stream is listened to by hundreds, maybe thousands of people, and if you're lucky, on the radio. But you also have this real advertising business that has real money. People paying for radio ads is real dollars. Where the advertising supported streaming services, that's also a weird business. There's not very much money in that as well. I'm sure Reason needs subscribers, not just advertisers, right?
Right.
Because digital advertising rates are so low. So it's a subjective opinion that it's too low, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence when you look at other things and how things behaved in non-digital markets and stuff like that it's a lot lower. Right. So that's one problem. The other problem was just sheerly the when the streaming services launched, the way the law was written, they had to go through a process to actually get the federal licenses, and a lot of them just didn't do that. Right. So what ended up happening was they didn't really know who to pay. So there was a whole class of independent artists that were never licensed and never got any royalties, no matter how low. And so the class actions were aimed at that, not the low rates, but just the fact that these services were not paying a large class of
and that involved
songwriters.
That involved platforms like Spotify, probably most notably, where I've seen different class action suits that you were involved in, or you really helped lead for, calling for $40 million or $20 million or whatever, or being settled. And that was for non-payment of royalties. And Spotify or the platform would say, well, we were happy to pay these very low royalty rates, but we have no idea who they are, or where we would send the payment to, so we're not going to do it. How were those cases settled?
Well, they were settled because we had them hands down. And I'm going to say something that's going to really surprise a lot of people here. It's not necessarily Spotify's fault in the case of Spotify and a couple of these other services, because they hired a third party. But they were liable, because we started out, we were going to sue the third party. But, we got to the lawyers, and the lawyers are like, well, yeah, but they're not really liable. It's the services that are liable.
Right.
It's a little crazy. You're like, hey, I'm an artist and we enter this digital age, and there's this one dominant player, Spotify, in this digital age, and I'm going to launch a class action against them. Yeah. That could be career suicide or maybe not, I don't really know. Right. But but all the services did effectively the same thing to some extent or another. They were not paying a lot of the independent writers. But what this did, so the real effect is not so much I think it ended up being I think after everything was all said and done, it was like 100 million that Spotify paid out. The other services were much lower amounts because they just don't have the market share. But it did drive the Music Modernization Act, which gave us a better system for licensing, collecting, and distributing those royalties. So now we're back to the first problem, is that the rates are too low, but at least we got at least we have the money coming in. So what it did, it drove a reform of the Copyright Act.
Before we talk about the royalty rates or modernizing those or changing those, out of, say, the $100 million, like you always hear about class action lawsuits where they get settled and there's a big amount, but then the people, the actual claimants, end up with pennies. Is that what happened here? And I'm thinking back to the tax, which I have not bought a blank cassette or videotape in years, but they all have taxes on them, which are for a pool of money that is supposed to go to uncompensated creators.
And nobody signs up for that. So it's weird though. If you do sign up for that, in the day when people were buying and recording on blank cassettes. If you did sign up for those royalties, it ended up being fairly substantial because nobody was signing up for that. Well, mostly the labels were signing up for it, but on the performer side, nobody was signing up for those.
Yeah.
Kind of the same thing happened with our well, there's multiple class actions. They get split off in different ways and stuff like that. So they're all sort of different. But with the Spotify class action, that pool of money had to go to the writers that signed up for it. So people got substantial payouts that signed up for it. I have all these weird little NDAs associated with this settlement, so I'm never sure what I can say, but it was substantial. Like people talked about it. It was like, wow, I actually got real money from the class action and stuff like that. So
that's great.
So that was good. But, you talk about these class actions where this is something people don't know about me. You talk about these class actions where people don't get any money. I was actually the objector to a case that went to the Supreme Court on a class action that I looked at. I was like, hey, I'm in this class, and they gave all the money away to like Google basically gave all the money away to essentially remember when Google drove around and swept up everybody's Wi-Fi traffic? So it's one of the class actions associated with that. And the settlement, the judges approved essentially giving money to all of these NGOs that Google was funding anyway, and also universities that, the attorneys were, alumni of the law school there and stuff like that. So me and this guy, Ted Frank, the attorney Ted Frank came to me who goes after. He loved me coming on because I was the leader of a class action. Right. And then I came on as his objector to object to these settlements. Right. In the end, we moved the ball a little bit, but we didn't really win anything. But that's a huge abuse. Class action lawsuits that no money goes to the classes. It just goes to the attorneys. So it's like insane.
With the royalty rates for mechanical or for plays on streaming services, and in at least one respect, they're better than for radio, right? Because they actually, the performers on streams get some small, they're in the pool of money. But what would make you feel like you were made whole? Like how would rates have to change as an artist? Because part of the argument, and I'm thinking back to the old kind of copyright abolitionist position, which is like, well, the idea behind copyright is to incentivize people to make music or write books or create stuff, and like that's going to happen anyway. So like maybe the royalty rates are not that important.
Yes and no. So there are definitely bands who have built up economic models. You think of the Grateful Dead, you can think of Fish or whatever, that are based on giving their music away largely, right? And taking their revenue from, live shows basically, right? And, people who write songs will probably write songs. The question, the tail off, the problem is the tail off is when you get into more expensive things like films and stuff like that. You got to have some sort of copyright regimen to make films and stuff. But also with songwriters and performers, it's like I feel like I made my best work once I got into my 30s, or maybe even now. I think at some point you stop producing as many songs if you have to have another job. Right. So it's the effect in music is more felt out in like album 4, 5, 6, 7, stuff like that, which for a lot of artists, they never get there with copyright or not. But I think over and over, the classic great artists, they really hit their stride during those albums. And I think that's where you would see the effect on music, which can be made fairly cheaply and stuff like that. I'll give you that. Right. So I think of it more that way. But I also don't like the fact of it kind of empowers freeloaders and platforms that seem to always end up being non-competitive if you don't have copyright. And I think that's a lot of effectively copyright is, well, it's like the eminent domain cases where the government takes your right and then gives it to a private entity. That's the way the compulsory licenses work in the digital realm. Right. That has a lot of unintended consequences that are not good, And so the rates, what would be the rates? Well, the first thing I would do is like just remove the compulsion, remove the compulsory licenses, which maybe move to something like, I don't want to get technical. There's something called extended collective licensing, where the first thing you would do is you would move to letting people have an opt out. And those who were happy with the system would stay in the system. Those who weren't would remove themselves from the system and be faced with the prospect of having to license their stuff outside of that system. But I think what I'm getting at is I don't know if there's a single price for every single song.
Right.
What we have right now is we have a price for every single song. I think all songs have different prices. I think they decay over time. I think the value of a song can decay over time. Some other songs start out at a low value and become very valuable. Right. Yeah. I think you just want to insert a lot more economic choice into the system. Yeah. And I'm not an expert. There was a librarian of Congress, though, who wrote about a system. Beth Peters wrote about I believe it was her who wrote about an extended collective licensing system, which would transition us back to more economic choice on these things. Yeah. I would sunset the compulsory licenses, because we don't, that's the problem. I can't point to a market price for a song in streaming.
Right. And that's fascinating to think about that happening at a time, and this is slightly different, but it's related, that as albums became disintermediated because, through the rise of Apple Music and whatnot, or, and even Napster, but where, why should all songs cost 99 cents, or whatever? And I remember the first time I went, I will confess to being a very active Napster user, and it actually got me back into music because I used it as a sampling service, and then I would go out and buy high quality things. But when Napster became legal and I was about to buy a song for $1, I was like, well, I don't want to buy, like Norwegian Wood by the Beatles, because it's like 1 minute and 58 seconds long. And then I was like, maybe I'll do Miracles by Jefferson Starship, because it's like 5.5 minutes long. And I was like, and I ended up buying Dreamweaver because it was even longer. And it's like, what the fuck is going on here? But the idea is taken, the point is taken, that different songs should have, they have different prices. Like we're willing to pay different prices for them.
Well, and did you remember the record? You're old enough to remember the record clubs, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was built on the notion that this album is 18 months old.
Right.
It's got a much lower price now. Yeah. And so what we're doing is we're bundling it all together with a bunch of stuff, right?
Yeah, including other records, at least for that first bunch. And and there was the nice price. I forget which label or labels did that, but where it would be back catalog records.
They would mid-price, it was called. Yeah.
Yeah. But, part of this, what's interesting, and in your work, or in your written work, and I suspect in the business classes that you teach, or the classes you teach at Georgia, you talk about this. One of the things that the rise of digital everything gave us was this dream of disintermediation, where finally, buyer and seller, you cut out the middleman and you can market directly to your customers. Your customers can find you because they don't have to go through these gatekeepers of various values. And we can set aside for a moment that, intermediaries are essential to capitalism and good functioning markets. And, they tell you what's out there. They do quality control, all sorts of positive things. But for the purposes of this conversation, disintermediation did not seem to deliver the promises to artists, to musical artists, that we were kind of hoping for. In a way, it's true. It's easier now than ever. If you have 5,000 true fans, you can make a living off of that. If you're a writer and you're on Substack, you can go directly to people and things like that, and that's good. But you, in a 2012 address, you talked that was titled "Meet the New Boss, Same as the Old Boss," and it's like the thing that is still around is like that somehow if it's either Spotify or it's Columbia Records or something, like these big giant entities that just end up collecting all of the money. I remember during the Senate hearings on Napster, listening to Roger McGuinn, of the leader of the Byrds, who had a good solo career. He's well known. He's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, testifying that he had never received a royalty on any of the records he was ever involved in because they never paid back the advance. And it's like, wow, the commercial music industry has in some significant way been exploitive of artists, of the content creators for its entire history. And it just seems to continue to be able to do that in new ways. Do you feel, is it that bad, or is the scene better now for people like you and people without, your reputation and your track record?
Well, I wouldn't trade it for the old business, the business now for the old business, because I mean, who's going to put out an autobiographical record for a 60-year-old, a 64-year-old guy? Which label would have done that in the 70s, right?
Right.
I mean, it would have to be somebody who would just want to take a chance on me. So creatively, there's a lot more control that's enabled by all these digital platforms and stuff like that. Yeah. But it's definitely hard to get your money away from the free riders out there, which we've always had a problem with, or the platforms or the intermediaries and stuff like that. Now, I fortunately came up in the business in the late 80s and the 90s when there was a lot of money beginning to slosh around the business. And artists, it was really competitive for the labels to sign artists. It was a very competitive marketplace. And we got pretty good contracts in that era, right? Yeah. By the 90s, we definitely got pretty good contracts because the artists seemed to have a lot of power in the business, right? And there was a lot of money slashing around. So, but Roger McGuinn, of course, grew up in a different time where basically you had very low royalty rates. The way the recoupment was counted was often, the way that calculation was made, you basically never saw any money. But the difference is at least you got advances in the old days. So you weren't financing the creation of the records out of your pockets, which is essentially what you do today. If you do get advances, they're much, much smaller. And a lot of times for indie artists, what you're doing is you're making the recording and then you're basically providing the music to the platforms on the installment plan. It's like, well, we'll just pay you every time we use it, and that sort of reversed the economic problem. Is like sort of the capital accumulation to make a record is kind of push back onto the artist, and you're kind of financing a lot of these platforms, and that just seems a problem to me. So. But, there's all kinds of other ways of dealing with it, which everybody's gone back to, is selling physical product. I remember the first time I downloaded Napster. I mean, I saw something downloaded on Napster. It was in my studio in the control room computer. Somebody needed to hear a song, and one of the interns is like, here, I put Napster on there. Let me go get it for you. Yeah. And I looked at that and I was like, wow. And I was like, started looking to see what songs were on there. And I was go, okay, so we're going to have a system where basically albums are either going to be $100 or free. Right. Is this got to be up to the fan, some deluxe edition? And that's kind of what we have with vinyl. Yeah. I mean, my 3 sets listing about $80. Yeah. So, or it's free, practically free on a streaming service.
Has it pushed back I heard Rick Rubin interview Todd Rundgren sometime recently, and he was and Rundgren, who is also somebody who's very tech savvy and actually was on an early version, like a precedent of Patreon and whatnot in the late 90s, but talked about how like what we're going back to is an older model for music where it's really about performing, and that it is about, that's where the money is going to be, because that's the thing that you can actually monetize. Do you feel like something like that is true? And is it good or bad, or is it just different?
It's just different, and it might actually favor the top tier of artists more than the bottom tier. Touring is a very low margin business. In fact, most of the time artists would kind of lose a little money on tour, and then you'd come home and the record sales would sort of be your payment. Your songwriting royalties or whatever would be kind of your payment, or the record company would pay you to go on tour.
Yeah.
So it's a low margin business. I think like we're just on the other side of the line where we can make money on touring and kind of figure it out with Cracker. I don't think Camper Van Beethoven is. I think they're on the other side of the line. So in a weird way, like if I was just in Cracker, I would look at this and have a much more positive accounting of the world. Also, we have hits that are recurrence that get, I mean, we have songs in our catalog with Cracker that are played 30 to 45 million times a year or something like that. That's a significant amount of revenue. And that, to me, I'm like, that's probably extra money that we wouldn't have normally got under the old system. Whereas with Camper Van Beethoven, relied on album sales. It's kind of there's a bifurcated system. It works for some business models and not for others. Live music is low margin. I think if you're a big enough star, or even if you can just do the soft tickets in the festivals, which is mostly what Cracker does, you make money off of it. But I don't think you do for Camper Van Beethoven. So that's why you see people putting their music for sale on Bandcamp and not on the streaming services where you have to buy it up front. You pay for all your streams essentially and stuff like that, where you sell CDs or you sell vinyl albums. It was only recent the jazz labels went to streaming because they were still living off of the physical sales, holding on to the old system. It's a mixed bag.
No, I mean, well, and, to kind of perhaps drive to a finish here, one of the things that I find, you're teaching at University of Georgia, you teach courses about the business of music and things like that. Are your students optimistic about, the future, or like, is there a music industry, or is even that just kind of using the wrong terminology, or like, how will people make money off of music in the future, and are people optimistic about that?
Well, you definitely still can make money on the live side. My wife is an executive and promotes concerts and stuff like that. And this year's not so great, but the last few years have been pretty good, right? There's definitely, you can make money off of live music. You always make money off of live music. It's the jury's a little more out on the recorded music, how that plays out and the models that work. Young people are naturally optimistic, so they think they're going to crack the nut on it. So I don't have to, I just need to give them the tools, and they'll go out there and try to crack the nut. You know what I mean? Like, try to figure out how to do this. And I feel like I have a lot of ex-students who are figuring it out. They're maybe not making the kind of living that I did in the 90s, or even maybe did in the 80s, but they're late 80s, but they're getting there, and there's some sort of career there. Many of my students, though, are actually trying to be on the business side, and they're doing pretty well. They're almost always going out there and working for management or getting a job with a label, whether they stick or not. They're going out and getting jobs and sort of able to. Most of them, if they do well in our classes, they mostly go out there and pursue a dream in the music business. Now, they may only stay there for 7 years and go, you know what, I did it. I'm going to go do something else. So I know I didn't quite answer the question there, but
no, that answers it for me. I guess as a final question, and you kind of alluded to this earlier in our conversation, but when you said, you realized that you were influenced by Bruce Springsteen, many years after the fact and things like that, or that, Do you feel like one of the things that really comes through, I think, very strongly on Fathers, Sons, and Brothers, and it's there in all of the work that you've been part of, is a really intense sense of tradition or of genealogy. And it's not in this hidebound, like, oh, we've got to play music exactly like they played it in Mississippi in 1952 on a porch or anything like that, but being informed by that. Could you talk a bit about how that seems to be simultaneously one of the things that is afforded by contemporary digital culture is that you can find and consume any music that's ever been recorded. You can watch almost any movie that's been recorded. You can read any book. There's so much more information, and yet it seems like people are less inclined to kind of figure out where they come from or how they fit into a particular tradition. And that seems to be important because a lot of people are like, I don't know who I am. I don't know where I'm going. And it's kind of like the tools are all here in front of you. Could you talk a little bit about how you have done that? Because to me, that is, written into the title of your album, but also kind of the body of your work. And it seems worth kind of driving home.
Yeah, well, so I got to do this experiment live with my career. We did Camper Van Beethoven, where we would say, okay, let's play something that's like music from the Balkans, but played in a surfer style, and you would just go everywhere and just do whatever. And with the notion that's like, we're not really going to get it right. And that's what's going to be cool about it. That's what we think is cool about listening to bands from the 60s who tried to do sitar music or something like that. They get it wrong, right?
Yeah.
But eventually with Camper Van Beethoven, we sort of discovered it's like, well, but when we're playing stuff that sits sort of more in the musical culture that we've been immersed in, well, if we just sit back into that a little more, it seems to be more powerful. And so by the time we get to Cracker, I'm leaning into that completely. I'm still going to do a little this and that. There's a little postmodernism in there, but I'm trying to make a Chesterton's fence joke, but I can't quite figure out how to make it. But it's like, it's not like we're doing that, it's not like we're sitting there trying to make, traditional blues or traditional country or Appalachian folk music or something like that with Cracker, but we are sitting back more into the traditions that we were raised in, where we just sort of intuitively know what we're supposed to play and stuff like that, right?
Yeah. I think we're going to leave it there. David Lowery, thank you so much for talking to Reason. It's been a real treat for me.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.